The town of West Pittston, Pennsylvania, did not look like the kind of place where nightmares were born. Tucked along the Susquehanna River, its rows of modest homes, leafy trees, and quiet streets carried the weight of working-class America in the 1970s. This was not New York City, bustling with crime and chaos, nor Los Angeles shimmering with glamour and shadows. West Pittston was ordinary, predictable, a town where neighbors waved at each other from porches, where children rode bicycles until dusk, and where families like the Smurls could hope for peace after a long week of labor. But in 1973, that illusion of peace began to unravel. Jack and Janet Smurl were, by all outward appearances, the very picture of a young American family. Jack worked as a technician for a local firm, while Janet took on the role of homemaker, caring for their 4 daughters. They were practicing Catholics, firmly rooted in faith, family, and the rhythms of community life. And when they moved into a simple duplex on Chase Street, half for jackass parents and half for their own growing family, they expected nothing more than stability, a place to raise children, a place to grow old. The duplex itself was unremarkable. It was built in the 19th century, solidly constructed, though aged and weather-worn. Wooden floors creaked underfoot. Pipes groaned in the winter. It was the kind of house that seemed to carry echoes of its past tenants, though no one in the neighborhood would have said it was haunted. For the Smurls, it was affordable, close to relatives, and most importantly, home. At first, the disturbances were subtle, a stain on the wall of the living room that seemed to bleed through no matter how many times Jack painted over it, water leaks that mysteriously reappeared even after repairs, the smell of something foul, like rotting flesh or burning garbage, that would waft through the house and then vanish as quickly as it came. The Smurls, practical people, chalked it up to old plumbing, faulty wiring, the quirks of an aging home. But there was a disquiet to it, a lingering unease that refused to fade. Then came the sounds. Footsteps moving across the attic when no one was upstairs. Loud bangs reverberating through the walls at night, jolting the children awake. Janet recalled hearing a baby crying, faint at first, then louder, though every time she rushed to check on her daughters, they were fast asleep. The noise did not seem tied to weather, or to the time of day, or to any rational cause. It was as though the house itself had found a voice, and it was not one of welcome. In the early months, Jack and Janet kept these things to themselves. They did not want to alarm the children, nor burden Jack's elderly parents who lived on the other side of the duplex. But silence, as they soon discovered, could not hold back the dark. By 1975, the activity had escalated. Furniture would move across the room on its own. Cabinet doors slammed with violent force. Lights flickered without reason, plunging the family into sudden darkness, only to flare back with blinding intensity. Jack, a rational man, searched for explanations. Faulty wiring, drafts, vibrations from passing trucks. But every explanation collapsed when he witnessed objects levitating, or when his daughters described the same dark shadow that had stood at the foot of their beds. The shadow figure was the most disturbing presence of all. It was tall, vaguely human, but its features were indistinguishable, blurred as if wrapped in smoke. Sometimes it hovered near the corners of rooms, retreating when confronted. Other times, it moved with intent, walking slowly down the hallway, pausing outside bedroom doors, waiting. The children began to refuse to sleep alone, and Janet herself confessed to friends that she felt watched constantly, even while bathing or cooking. Fear spread like mold through the house. And then, the attacks began. Janet would wake in the night to an invisible force pressing down on her chest, pinning her to the bed. She could not scream, could not move, only listen to the rasping breath of something unseen just inches from her face. Jack reported being scratched across his arms and chest by claws that left deep red welts. Even their German shepherd would growl and bark furiously at empty corners of the room, fur standing on end, until it bolted away whimpering. Most horrifying of all were the assaults that turned sexual. Janet spoke of being touched, groped, even violated by an unseen presence. Jack, too, claimed he had been dragged from his bed and assaulted in the basement by a shadowy succubus. The family, devout in their Catholic faith, was horrified by the implications, that something demonic had set its eyes upon them. By this time, the Smurls could no longer keep their suffering private. Their children were terrified, their health was failing, and the walls of their home seemed saturated with evil. They reached out to priests, begging for blessings and prayers of protection. Priests came, sprinkling holy water and reading rites. But each time the disturbances only grew more violent, as though the entity mocked their attempts. Neighbors began to whisper. The family seemed exhausted, worn thin. Their children no longer played outside. Janet appeared pale and withdrawn. Jack confessed to co-workers that he felt helpless, even emasculated, unable to protect his wife and daughters from something he could not see. Word eventually spread beyond West Pittston. Paranormal investigators caught wind of the case, and among them were the most famous demonologists of the era, Ed and Lorraine Warren. Fresh from the notoriety of the Amityville horror, the Warrens were no strangers to homes plagued by dark forces. When the Smurls called for help, the couple arrived with crucifixes, holy water, and tape recorders in hand. What they encountered in the Smurl home would become one of the most terrifying and controversial hauntings in American history. And it was only the beginning. By the mid-1980s, the Smurl haunting was no longer a private family matter. What had begun as whispers of creaking floorboards and flickering lights had swollen into a saga of terror. One that priests, neighbors, and even local journalists could no longer ignore. For years, the family had endured in silence, clinging to their Catholic faith, hoping that prayer would drive away the darkness. But by 1986, desperation overcame pride, and Jack and Janet Smurl made the call that would change the trajectory of their story forever. They reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens were not strangers to notoriety. By then, they were already infamous for their involvement in the Amityville horror, a case that had launched them into the public spotlight and cemented their reputation as America's foremost demonologists. To believers, they were heroic defenders against the forces of hell. To skeptics, they were opportunists exploiting vulnerable families for fame. But for the Smurls, none of that mattered. They needed help. And when Ed and Lorraine arrived at 330 Chase Street, crucifixes in hand, it seemed like salvation had finally walked through their door. Lorraine, a clairvoyant, claimed she felt the oppressive atmosphere immediately. "This place is alive with evil," she whispered, clutching her rosary as she stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy, almost suffocating. Ordinary sounds, the ticking of a clock, the hum of a refrigerator, seemed muted, as though the house itself was listening. Ed, ever the pragmatist, began unpacking equipment, tape recorders, cameras, and holy water. He believed in documentation. If the demonic was here, he wanted proof. The Smurls gathered nervously in the living room, recounting their years of torment. Janet's voice trembled as she described being held down by unseen hands, her words trailing into silence when the shame of her assaults became too heavy. Jack clenched his fists, his jaw tight, as he spoke of being dragged from his bed and forced into encounters that left him humiliated and broken. The children clung to their grandparents, their faces pale, their eyes darting at every creak in the old wooden frame of the duplex. And then, as though to punctuate the horror of their testimonies, the house itself responded. A loud crash echoed from the kitchen. Everyone froze. When they rushed to investigate, they found a cabinet door swinging violently on its hinges, though no one had touched it. A crucifix that Ed had hung moments earlier lay twisted on the floor. Lorraine closed her eyes, whispering prayers under her breath. "It mocks us," she said. "It wants us to know it's listening." Over the following weeks, the Warrens conducted a series of investigations. They stayed late into the night, recording strange sounds, guttural growls, heavy footsteps, and on one occasion, a voice that seemed to call out Janet's name in a deep, distorted tone. Lorraine reported visions of shadowy figures moving through the house, sometimes appearing as men, sometimes as beasts, their forms shifting like smoke. One particularly chilling moment came when she claimed to see a figure that resembled a man with half his face rotted away, standing at the foot of one of the children's beds. Ed, armed with his deep Catholic faith, attempted to provoke the entity. He recited the rite of exorcism, sprinkling holy water through the rooms. The response was immediate and violent. The house shook with loud bangs, and a foul stench filled the air. Jack was suddenly thrown against the wall as though an invisible hand had struck him. One of the daughters screamed that something had pulled her hair, yanking her from her chair. Lorraine later said that the force within the Smurl home was not a mere ghost, not a wandering spirit, but a full-fledged demonic infestation. The Warrens concluded that multiple entities were present. Some appeared human, perhaps remnants of those who had once lived in the house or in the land before it. But one presence, Lorraine insisted, was darker, older, and immensely powerful. This entity, she claimed, was orchestrating the torment, feeding on the family's fear, draining their strength, and sowing despair. Word of the Warrens' involvement spread quickly. Local reporters began sniffing around the duplex, curious about the so-called haunted house on Chase Street. Some neighbors backed up the Smurls' claims, saying they had heard screams or seen lights flickering at odd hours. Others scoffed, accusing the family of exaggeration or seeking attention. The small town became divided, some sympathetic, others suspicious. Meanwhile, the Smurls' lives continued to unravel. Jack grew withdrawn, haunted by his inability to protect his wife and children. Janet's health deteriorated, her face pale and drawn from sleepless nights. Their daughters, once lively, became quiet, frightened to play in their own bedrooms. Even Jack's elderly parents, who had once dismissed the early disturbances, admitted to feeling cold hands brushing against their skin or hearing growls in the dead of night. The Warrens escalated their efforts. They brought in other investigators, recording hours of audio and video, capturing mysterious knocks and eerie voices. They appealed to the Catholic Church, urging for a full exorcism. But the Church, cautious and skeptical, hesitated. Without undeniable proof, they were reluctant to sanction such measures, leaving the Smurls trapped between their faith and their terror. One night, during a particularly intense investigation, Ed attempted a direct confrontation. Standing in the basement with a crucifix in hand, he commanded the entity to reveal itself. What followed was chaos. The lights flickered violently, the air grew unbearably hot, and a deep guttural growl filled the space, shaking the very walls. Ed staggered, clutching his chest, and later reported that the force had attempted to suffocate him. Lorraine pulled him upstairs, insisting that they had pushed too far. To the Smurls, it felt like the haunting was escalating, feeding on the attention. Every attempt to fight back seemed only to make the entity stronger. And yet, they could not leave. Financially, they were tied to the house. Emotionally, they were bound by fear. The duplex, once a symbol of family unity, had become a prison. As months dragged into years, the Smurls' story spread beyond Pennsylvania. Newspapers ran headlines about the haunted house of West Pittston. Television crews arrived, hungry for sensational footage. Skeptics and believers debated fiercely, each side accusing the other of lies. For the Smurls, the publicity was both a blessing and a curse. It brought attention to their suffering, but it also invited ridicule, painting them as either victims of the supernatural or perpetrators of a hoax. Through it all, the Warrens remained steadfast. Lorraine warned that the family's suffering would not end quickly. The entity, she said, was cunning and patient. It would not be banished easily, and unless the church intervened, the Smurls might face years of torment. It was a haunting that seemed to defy resolution, a case where faith, fear, and skepticism collided, leaving the Smurls caught in the crossfire. And as the years wore on, the line between the living and the dead blurred further, until even the skeptics had to ask themselves, what truly was happening inside the walls of 330 Chase Street? By 1986, the Smurl Haunting had transformed from a family's private nightmare into a public controversy. What had once been whispered about at kitchen tables now made headlines in local papers. The duplex at 330 Chase Street no longer looked like just another modest Pennsylvania home. It had become a stage where believers, skeptics, priests, and journalists all gathered to project their own interpretations of what was happening inside. The Warrens, sensing the gravity of the case, believed it was essential to make the story known. Ed argued that sunlight could expose the darkness. If people understood the danger, if the church felt public pressure, perhaps then an official exorcism could be sanctioned. And so, with the Smurls' hesitant approval, the Warrens opened the doors to the media. It began with small features, articles in the Scranton Times, local radio shows recounting strange noises and ghostly apparitions. But the story spread quickly, feeding on the era's fascination with the paranormal. Soon, larger outlets like the Philadelphia Inquirer and national TV programs sent crews to West Pittston. Reporters stood outside the house, microphones in hand, describing the screams neighbors claimed to have heard, or the sulfurous odors that seemed to hang in the air around the property. The Smurls, shy and soft-spoken by nature, suddenly found themselves thrust into the spotlight. Jack appeared in interviews, his face pale and drawn, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Janet sat beside him, often in tears, as she described the unseen torment that plagued their nights. The children were shielded from cameras, but whispers about their suffering seeped into the coverage. The media attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it validated their pain, showing the world they were not alone in their claims. On the other, it invited ridicule. Skeptics accused the family of inventing the haunting for fame or financial gain. Some suggested the Smurls were suffering from stress, hallucinations, or even mental illness. Others accused the Warrens of exploiting a vulnerable family for publicity. Neighbors, too, were divided. Some swore they had heard screams or seen strange lights flickering from the house at odd hours. One man claimed he saw a dark shadow cross his lawn after leaving the Smurls' duplex, but others rolled their eyes, dismissing it as hysteria. One neighbor told a reporter, "That family's been through a lot. But ghosts? Demons? I don't buy it." The scrutiny reached the Catholic Church, but here the response was cautious, even cold. Official exorcisms are rare, performed only after exhaustive investigation. In the Smurls' case, the church hesitated, fearing the sensationalism surrounding the story might undermine their credibility. Priests did visit the home, conducting blessings and prayers, but the entity mocked these efforts. Crucifixes were torn from walls. Holy water boiled away. On one occasion, a visiting priest fled the house after being overwhelmed by the stench of decay and the sound of guttural laughter echoing from nowhere. For the Smurls, it felt like abandonment. Their faith, once their strongest weapon, now seemed fragile. Janet clung to her rosary until her fingers bled, whispering prayers through tears. Jack attended Mass, but returned home each time to the same suffocating presence. Even the children began to lose hope. "Why won't God help us?" one of the daughters reportedly asked her mother in the middle of a sleepless night. Meanwhile, the haunting itself continued to escalate. Jack reported being physically assaulted by the entity, dragged across the floor, scratched and bruised by invisible claws. Janet described waking in the middle of the night to see a shadow looming above her, its form shifting between man, beast, and something indescribable. She often felt a crushing weight on her chest, pressing down with suffocating force until she gasped for air. The elderly grandparents, once skeptical, now admitted their own terror. Mary Smurl told investigators she awoke one night to hear chains dragging across the floorboards, followed by the sound of heavy breathing beside her bed. She lit a lamp, but found the room empty. In the morning, deep scratches marred the wooden floor, marks no one could explain. And then there were the voices. The family heard them most often at night. Guttural growls, mocking laughter, and whispers that seemed to slither directly into their ears. Sometimes the voices mimicked loved ones. Jack once swore he heard his mother's voice calling his name from the kitchen, only to discover the room was empty and his mother fast asleep upstairs. The Warrens recorded many of these occurrences. Their tapes captured strange knocks, growls, and even faint words in languages no one recognized. Lorraine claimed the entity would taunt her directly, speaking in tones only she could hear. "It tells me it will never leave," she confessed to Janet after one session, her face pale with fear. As the case gained national attention, pressure mounted on the church to act. Finally, after years of torment, the Smurls were granted an official investigation by church authorities. Priests arrived to assess the home, conducting solemn rites, sprinkling holy water, chanting prayers in Latin. For a brief period, the family felt relief. The air seemed lighter, the nights grew quieter, but it did not last. Within weeks, the activity returned, louder, darker, and more violent than ever. Ed Warren believed the entity was retaliating, enraged by the church's intervention. The Smurls felt trapped in a war they could never win, pawns in a battle between heaven and hell. By the late 1980s, the haunting had become one of the most infamous in America. Books were written, TV specials aired, skeptics and believers debated furiously, while the Smurls continued to suffer in their home. Jack and Janet, once private and ordinary people, had become unwilling symbols of the supernatural. And yet, through all the noise, through all the investigations and debates, one truth remained. The Smurls themselves never wavered in their claims. They insisted until the end of their lives that what happened to them was real, that their home had been invaded by a darkness beyond comprehension, and that the scars, physical, emotional, and spiritual, would never fade. But if their story was true, then one question lingered. Why? Why this family? Why this home? And as we move into the next chapter, the answer may lie not just in the walls of 330 Chase Street, but in the very fabric of evil itself. The kind of evil the Warrens believed could move from house to house, from generation to generation, never truly defeated, only waiting. By the end of the 1980s, the Smurl family had been living with their haunting for over a decade. Their lives had been torn apart, reshaped by an invisible force that seemed to thrive on their despair. They had endured attacks, assaults, whispers in the dark, and shadows that crawled across their walls. They had turned to priests, neighbors, and finally the Warrens for help. They had pleaded with the Catholic Church, endured ridicule from skeptics, and shared their torment with the world through media interviews and documentaries. And yet, as the years slipped by, the entity remained. Eventually, Jack and Janet made a painful decision. In 1989, after nearly 15 years of fear and exhaustion, the Smurls left 330 Chase Street behind. They moved to a new home, desperate for peace. For the first time in years, they slept without dread. The new house, to their relief, seemed free of the terror that had followed them for so long. The dark shadows and guttural voices remained behind, or so they hoped. But not everyone believed the haunting ended with their move. Some argued the entity might have attached itself to the family, not the house, and could return at any time. Lorraine Warren herself warned that such spirits were cunning and persistent, capable of following their victims wherever they fled. For the Smurls, each creak in the night carried the threat of relapse, a reminder that safety might only be temporary. As the Smurls rebuilt their lives, the case continued to echo in public memory. In 1986, before the family left the house, a book titled The Haunted was released, co-authored by Ed and Lorraine Warren and journalist Robert Curran. It chronicled the Smurls' ordeal in chilling detail, bringing their story to an even wider audience. Critics attacked the book, calling it sensationalist, but for many readers, it was a terrifying glimpse into the possibility of demonic infestation. The story reached an even larger audience in 1991 when a made-for-TV movie, also called The Haunted, aired on primetime television. Starring Sally Kirkland and Jeffrey DeMunn as Janet and Jack Smurl, the film dramatized their years of torment, portraying the dark shadows, the violent assaults, and the desperate struggle for faith. For some viewers, it was their first encounter with the Smurl Haunting. For others, it was a reminder of just how deeply the case had embedded itself in American paranormal folklore. But alongside the believers came the critics. Skeptical investigators accused the Smurls of exaggeration, misinterpreting ordinary household noises, or even fabricating the haunting entirely. Psychologists speculated that stress, trauma, and sleep paralysis could explain many of the family's experiences. Others suggested the Warrens, eager for another headline case, had influenced the Smurls' interpretation of events. The Catholic Church, while acknowledging the family's suffering, never publicly confirmed that a genuine demonic presence had been identified. And yet, the Smurls themselves never wavered. Until their final days, they insisted that everything they described had truly happened. Jack, in particular, remained steadfast, often repeating, "We didn't ask for this. We didn't want the publicity. We just wanted it to stop." The enduring mystery of the Smurl Haunting lies in this tension between belief and skepticism, between faith and doubt, between the visible world and the invisible. Did the Smurls endure one of the most violent hauntings in American history? Or were they caught in the grip of psychological and social pressures, their suffering misinterpreted through the lens of faith and fear? The Warrens were certain of their answer. Lorraine called the Smurl case one of the darkest they had ever faced, second only to Amityville in intensity. Ed warned that what plagued the family was not a ghost, but a demon, an intelligence older than humanity itself, one that sought only to corrupt and destroy. To them, the Smurls had been targeted not randomly, but deliberately, chosen because their faith and closeness as a family made them a challenge worth breaking. For the Smurls, the ordeal left permanent scars. Their marriage, though strong, bore the weight of years of terror. Their children grew up under the shadow of the haunting, forced to reconcile their childhood memories with a world that doubted them. Even their neighbors, caught between pity and suspicion, remained divided. Some swore they had seen or heard the inexplicable. Others dismissed it all as hysteria. And yet, as decades passed, the Smurl Haunting refused to fade from memory. It lingered in books, documentaries, and conversations around late-night campfires. It lingered in the Warrens' lectures, where they recounted the case as proof of the reality of the demonic. And most recently, it lingered in cinema, inspiring The Conjuring: Last Rites, a film that drew heavily from the Smurls' ordeal to craft its story of faith tested by darkness. For those who watch the movie, the story may feel larger than life, shaped by Hollywood's dramatic hand. But beneath the special effects and chilling sound design lies a simple, enduring truth. A family once sat in their modest Pennsylvania home, listening to the floorboards creak, the shadows shift, and the whispers that no one else could hear. And they asked themselves, as countless families have before and since, what if the evil in our home is real? What if it never leaves? Even today, the duplex at 330 Chase Street still stands. New families have lived there, some claiming peace, others whispering of unease. Visitors pass by, curious about the haunted house, their eyes lingering on its weathered windows. Some say the house is quiet now, emptied of its darkness. Others believe the shadows only slumber, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between faith and fear. Perhaps the Smurls were victims of forces beyond our comprehension. Or perhaps they carried the weight of their own struggles, magnified by the anxieties of their time. In the end, the line between reality and belief may not matter. For the Smurls, their suffering was real. And that is what haunts us most. Because if their story is true, then evil is not confined to distant castles or ancient ruins. It can live in a duplex in suburban Pennsylvania. It can linger in bedrooms, basements, and hallways, just like the ones we call home. And if the Smurl Haunting teaches us anything, it is this: the darkness does not always stay buried in legend. Sometimes it walks with us, unseen, just beyond the veil of ordinary life. So, the question remains. When the lights go out, when the house grows still, and when you hear that faint whisper in the dark, are you sure you are truly alone?